Listen, I am Mama Otomba, and I have seen instruments remember what men try to forget. I have seen music breathe like a living thing in the back rooms of Harlem, where the smoke hangs low and the night never truly ends, where the year is always 1953, in the way the jazz never stops bleeding through cracked brick walls and broken dreams. I tell you this not as a story to entertain, but as a warning wrapped in memory. Because what happened with that piano was not music alone. It was something older than sound, something that came across oceans with chains and prayers and names that were never written down. I was already old then, living above a small storefront on 133rd Street, where the heat of summer made the walls sweat and the sound of trumpets from the clubs below climbed into my bones like spirits looking for shelter. That was the year they brought the piano into the Blue Garter Club, a place where men with tired eyes came to forget the law outside, and women with painted lips danced like they were trying to outrun their own reflections. The piano was black, but not like wood should be black. It was deeper, like it had swallowed every shadow that ever touched it, and the man who carried it in said it came from a burned-down theater in Louisiana, though his voice shook when he said it as if even he did not believe the words he was speaking. From the first night it was played, the air in the club changed because the notes did not behave like notes are supposed to behave. They lingered too long, they bent in ways that made the glass tremble and the floorboards sigh, and the musicians began to whisper that the piano was remembering things on its own. I first heard it while sitting in the corner, my fingers wrapped around a small pouch of herbs and bone, the kind my grandmother taught me to carry when I entered places where spirits drink alongside men. And when the pianist struck the first chord, I felt something inside me turn its head as if awakened by a familiar call. His name was Eli Mercer, a quiet man from Mississippi with hands that never stopped shaking unless he was playing. And he told me once in passing that the piano did not respond to him, but rather insisted through him, like it was pulling sound out of his marrow instead of the keys. On the third night, a fight broke out in the club, but no one remembered why. And the piano kept playing even after Eli stepped away from it, the keys moving as though invisible fingers pressed them with purpose and anger. And that was when I knew this was no ordinary instrument, but something bound to memory, to pain, to the spirits of those who had once poured themselves into music and never truly left it behind. I went to the back alley that night, where the drums of distant clubs echoed like heartbeats through brick and steel, and I called on the old names my mother had taught me, names that taste like iron and river water, asking the ancestors if this was their doing. But the answer did not come from above or below, it came from inside the music itself, like the sound was speaking in a language only my blood understood. The piano had belonged to many hands before Eli, hands that were now dead, hands that had played in churches, in fields, and plantations, in smoky rooms where no man wrote their names down, and each of those hands had left something behind in the wood, something that refused to stay silent. I warned the club owner, a man who cared more for profit than for breath itself, but he only laughed and said the people liked the new sound that made them spend more money and stay longer in their sin, and he told me old women always see ghosts where there's only ambition. But I knew better, because that night I saw a man sitting at the piano who was not Eli, a man with no face I could fully remember, even after staring at him, his fingers moving with a fury that made the air crack like glass. And when I blinked he was gone, but the piano kept playing his rage as if it had never needed his body at all. The next evening Eli did not come to the club for hours, and when he finally arrived, his eyes were hollow, like he had been listening to something no living man should endure, and he whispered to me that the piano was showing him places he had never been, fields of music where every note ever played still lingered like spirits refusing burial, and in those fields he saw the dead musicians waiting for something to finish. That was when I realized the piano was not remembering randomly, it was calling, gathering fragments of souls through sound, stitching them together through melody like a ritual no priest had ever written down. And Harlem, with all its lights and sins and songs, was becoming its altar. The first time I understood that the piano was not only remembering but choosing. It was during a rain-heavy night when Harlem felt like it was drowning in its own history, the streets shining like dark mirrors under broken lamplights, and every step I took toward the Blue Garter Club felt heavier, as if the ground itself remembered every sin committed above it. Inside, the music was already playing before Eli even touched it, slow and deliberate like a breath, held too long in a dying chest, and the audience sat in a trance that was not joy but surrender, as if each note was pulling something out of them they had never agreed to give. I watched a woman near the stage begin to weep without sound, her hands trembling as though she recognized something in the melody that belonged to another life, another body, another name that had been taken from her before she could speak it aloud. Eli stood beside the piano instead of sitting, his eyes fixed on the keys, as if he feared them more than any man in the room. And when he finally placed his hands down, the sound that came out was not his own. It was layered with others, like a choir buried beneath wood and ivory, rising through him unwillingly. I felt the spirits then, not as shadows or whispers, but as weight, as presence pressing against my skin, and I reached into my pouch and scattered salt mixed with ash under my breath, calling softly to the ancestors who walk between worlds where music is not entertainment, but memory made dangerous. The club owner tried to speak to me over the sound, his voice sharp with greed and disbelief, telling me the crowd had never been larger, the money never heavier, but even he stopped when a single chord struck that made every glass in the room vibrate without being touched. That chord carried a name inside it, a name I had not heard spoken in decades, a man from New Orleans, who had died with his trumpet still warm in his hands, and I knew then that the piano was not just remembering musicians, it was collecting them, pulling their final moments into itself like offerings. Eli began to change after that night, his skin growing paler not from sickness, but from absence, as if something inside him was being slowly replaced by something that did not need blood to exist. And he told me in a voice that was no longer fully his, that the piano showed him a place beyond sound where every dead musician still played their last song, forever trapped in an endless performance that never resolved. I tried to stop him from returning to the stage, but music has a way of calling men louder than fear ever can, and so he went back. And when his fingers touched the keys that night, the entire room went silent, as if the world itself was holding its breath. What came out was not jazz anymore, but something older, something that sounded like grief structured into rhythm. And I saw just for a moment the outline of figures behind him, standing so close they almost wore his body like a garment, each one pressing a fragment of their unfinished music through his hands. I left the club before the final set ended because I could feel the boundary between worlds thinning, and in the alley behind the building, I performed a small ritual my grandmother once used to close doors that should never be opened, drawing circles in rainwater and whispering names that had no written language, only breath and bone to carry them. But even as I did, the music followed me, leaking through brick and stone, and I realized with a coldness in my chest that the piano did not belong inside the club anymore. It was expanding its memory, reaching outward into the city, into Harlem itself, searching for more dead voices to complete whatever symphony it believed it was meant to finish. The next morning, 3 musicians who had played that night were found unable to speak, their mouths moving silently as if still trying to match a rhythm only they could hear, and the newspapers called it shock. But I knew it was theft. I went to Eli's room above the club where he sat staring at his hands as though they no longer obeyed him, and he told me the piano had shown him its origin, not Louisiana as the owner claimed, but deeper. Older places where sound was used as binding, where music was not art but containment, a way to trap what should not walk freely among the living. He said the piano was built from wood taken from a burned hall where hundreds had died mid-performance, their final notes never completed, and that every unfinished sound had fused into the grain, waiting for a new conductor of the dead. When I touched his forehead, I felt cold inside him that did not belong to sickness or exhaustion, and I knew he was already partially inside the instrument's memory, his identity stretched thin across notes he did not control. That night I decided I would enter the club not as observer but as breaker of patterns, because something in the music was preparing to open fully, and Harlem would not survive what came through if it was allowed to finish its song. I entered the Blue Garter Club just as the night thickened into something that felt less like time and more like a loop refusing to end. And the moment I crossed the threshold, I knew the piano was waiting for me, as if it had been listening for my footsteps long before I decided to come. The air inside was no longer simply smoke and perfume and sweat, but layered with echoes, like every song ever played there had not faded but stacked itself into invisible walls that pressed against my skin. The crowd was there again, though their faces looked dulled, almost erased by repetition, as if they had been sitting in that same trance for days without knowing the difference between night and morning anymore. Eli stood by the piano without moving, his hands hovering above the keys, as though he was afraid that touching them would finally erase what little remained of him. And when he saw me, he shook his head slightly, as if warning me not to listen. But it was already too late for warnings, because the music had already begun without him. The piano played itself in full now, every key striking with deliberate memory, and the sound was no longer performance but summoning, pulling something vast and unseen through the cracks of reality like water rising through broken stone. I stepped closer, holding the pouch of ash and salt tighter than I had ever held anything in my life, and I began to speak the binding words my grandmother used when she once closed a river spirit back into silence. But the piano answered me, not in language, but in melody that bent my voice mid-prayer, twisting it into something unrecognizable. Behind the sound, I saw them clearly for the first time, not as shadows but as presences layered into the music itself. Dozens of musicians who had died unfinished, their faces flickering between sorrow and rage, all pressed into the piano's memory like ink soaking through paper. Eli suddenly screamed, not in pain but in recognition, because he could see them too now without filter, and he fell to his knees as his hands finally struck the keys in response, no longer resisting but merging, as if the last piece of him had accepted that it was already gone. The club owner tried to run, but the doors would not open, and I understood then that the piano had sealed the room, not with locks, but with rhythm, each beat a barrier, each chord a wall no human hand could break. I stepped onto the stage, directly in front of the instrument, and placed my palms above its surface without touching it, feeling the heat of centuries of stolen breath vibrating through the wood, and I spoke the oldest name I knew, the one that does not belong to any tongue, but to the space between heartbeat and silence. The piano responded by playing louder, not resisting, but revealing itself fully, and I saw its origin not as object, but as wound. A place where music had been used to contain suffering so vast it refused to die, and in doing so it had learned to hunger for continuation. Eli's body began to fade at the edges like paper caught in flame, not burning but becoming part of the sound, and I knew I could not save him without breaking the entire structure holding this cursed memory together. So I made the choice my ancestors would understand, even if the living would not, and I began to sing the closing counter rhythm, the one meant not to fight sound, but to complete it in a way that ends its need to exist. The club shook as my voice and the piano collided, not in conflict but in forced alignment, and the spirits inside the instrument screamed without sound as their unfinished songs were finally given an ending they could not escape. Eli looked at me one last time, and in his eyes there was no fear anymore, only release, as if he finally understood that he was never the player but always part of what was being played. When the final chord struck, it was not loud but absolute, like the world inhaling after holding its breath for centuries, and the piano cracked down its center as though something inside it had been unstitched from existence itself. The spirits did not scatter, they rose, not as victims or captives anymore, but as echoes finally allowed to fade, and Harlem outside continued unaware for a moment too long before sound returned to normal, like nothing had ever broken. The club fell silent, the kind of silence that does not feel empty but finished, and when I stepped down from the stage there was only ash where the piano had stood, fine and harmless like burned memory, no longer able to hurt anyone. Eli was gone without body or trace, not taken but released into whatever place unfinished music goes when it is finally allowed to end, and I stood there until the smoke cleared because I needed to be sure the silence would hold. Since that night, I have never returned to the Blue Garter Club, but sometimes when Harlem is quiet, and the distance between buildings feels too thin, I hear a single note that does not belong to any living hand, and I know it is not calling anymore, only remembering that it once existed. And I am Mama Otomba, and I tell you this so you understand that some music is not meant to be played, only laid to rest.